guys, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another video for Not Too Shabby. Today we're going to be using the Bundles of Joy stamp set by MFT to create 3 very clean and simple cards using some scraps that we probably all have accumulated. So I have a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp my image 3 times with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. I am going to color her 3 times and fussy cut her out, but I'm only going to show you the coloring of just one of them because I did my shading all the same with all 3 images. I just kind of switched up the colors of the hair and skin. So I'm going to start off again, as always, with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas, and then I'll go in with my darkest color and kind of work my way down. For the shadows on her, it's going to be underneath where her hair is hanging over her face, and on her little neck area there where her chin is hanging over. Her arm that is bent, there is going to be one little flick line, and this is actually part of the illustration, so you can kind of use that as your guide. And just on the inside of her arm, on her legs, for her outer leg there, it's going to be off to the left-hand side for her other one too, because it's kind of tucked behind the other leg. So that would create a shadow. Next, going in with my darkest mid-tone, and I'm just extending those areas out a little bit further, and I'll kind of just do that until I reach that lightest color again that we had started off with. Now for her one hand that's kind of tucked behind her, that's holding that flower, most of that is going to be in shadow because her hand is closed, and it's probably hard to see in the video, but it's actually part of the stamp where there is some some detail to her. And so just use those lines. Whenever there's lines there, just use those to your advantage to kind of guide you as far as where there should be some shading. So next I'm going to go in with my R21 just to add a little bit of color to her cheeks, and then I'll quickly go over that area with my lightest color again, just to kind of tone that down a little bit. Next, for her hair, I always start with my darkest color for her hair. Now, for this particular image, you don't need a whole lot of detail for her hair, so I wouldn't be too concerned about getting a perfect flick here. But I do add some shading where her hair is parted and where it's kind of tucked behind her ears a little bit. And then I'll just extend that out a little bit each time. There is going to be a highlight basically on the sides of her hair on each side because her hair is parted more towards the middle. But like I said, there's not going to be a whole lot of detail that's needed for these particular images. So next I'm going to move on to her little dress there and her shoes, and I want these to appear to be white. So I'm going to add just some shading with my C markers. Any object that is white is still going to have shadows and shading. So with my C markers, I typically go right in with my darkest color just because I find that these blend really well. I'm just adding a little bit of shading where her basket and the flowers would cast a shadow on the bottom part of her dress, where her little sleeve there would cast a shadow, and where the little belt on her dress would be as well. That was with my C5, which is my darkest color, and I'll add that very sparingly. Then moving on to the C3 and just extending those areas out just a bit further. And then finally the C1, and I'm going to flick those colors out or those shades out, but still leave some white space. I do quickly go in with my colorless blender just to get rid of those flick lines so that I have more of a seamless blend. For her shoes, I'm going to use the same color combination, and I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to the left-hand side and where that one shoe is behind the other. That would also cast a shadow, so there's not going to be a whole lot of white space left in that particular one. So for her little basket, I'm going to switch over to some E30 markers. I did have a few areas that I went out of the lines because I'm a messy colorist. So I fixed those up with my colorless blender first. And now we'll move on to the E30s to color in her basket. So like always, I'm going to start off with my lightest color to map out those darkest areas. The darkest areas will be underneath where the flowers and leaves are kind of tucked or hanging over the basket, and a little bit off to the left-hand side. She's facing towards the right, so I'm just concentrating my shadings, or most of my shading being off to the left. going in with that darkest color to go over those areas that we had mapped out, flicking out just a little bit of color off to the left-hand side so that is more in shadow, blending that out with the E33, and then finishing off with the E31 that we had started with. Now for the flowers and leaves, these are really, really teeny tiny images. You do not have to do any shading at all to most of these or any of these really. But I did pretty much stick to a 2-color blend. Some of the larger flowers, I did a 3-color blend, but like I said, this is completely optional. And I pretty much just picked some pinks and oranges and purples and greens naturally for the leaves. And honestly, I just kind of randomly picked them. Now you'll see that once the coloring is all done, you'll see that they were all pretty much colored the same except for the skin tones and hair and the little belt around their dress. For one, I picked more of a yellow, one is a pink, and one is a purple. And I pretty much did this so that my scrap piece of paper pieces of paper that we're going to use to create our card or create some, I guess, create the background for our cards will kind of match. So I purposely colored those all different, but pretty much the flowers and their dresses and everything were exactly the same. Now for this larger flower that she's holding, I did use a 3-color blend. Not that you can really notice because the petals are so teeny tiny, but being she's holding this flower, I figured this would be a little bit more noticeable than the rest of the flowers in the basket. So I did add a little bit more shading to that than I did for the rest of the flowers. For the leaves, I only used a 2-color blend for these as well. And for the centers of the flower, it's literally like one teeny tiny little dot. So it really doesn't matter what yellow or orange or whatever color you decide to add to the middles of the flowers. It really won't make a difference because you're not really going to see too much of it anyway. Now for teeny tiny areas like this, when you're only using a 2-color blend, I recommend that you use 2 that are not very close to one another. So normally colors that you wouldn't necessarily think would blend, if you're looking to get contrast, it's important to use colors that are very far apart from one another, if that makes any sense, so that you can still see that contrast while only using just 2 markers. So once the coloring was done, I'll go ahead and fussy cut these out. You can definitely, there is a coordinating die. I don't have the coordinating die, or you can use a scan and cut, but they were actually pretty easy to fussy cut. So I fussy cut all 3 of those, and then we'll move on to the assembly of the cards. So like I said, I used some scrap pieces of paper from my scrap bin to create a little bit of a background. And most of these are very, very simple, just cut down into strips. So for my first card, I am going to use my white. I have a lot of scrap white. So here is my card panel right here. And I'm going to take that scrap piece of white and I'm taking my paper trimmer here and just cut down into strips. And these are going to be 1/4 of an inch wide, but you can use any width you'd like. And I'm just using the grid lines on my trimmer here to make sure that all of these are the same exact size. And then we're just going to assemble these onto the card panel. And you can do this any way you want. You can do this horizontal, vertical, but in my case, I wanted to do these diagonal. So I'm using the grid mat here that I work on to line up the corners to make sure that all of my little strips are straight. So I'm using these grid lines also to make sure that when while I assemble my background here, that all of my strips are straight and lined up perfectly with one another. Now you could probably eyeball this, but I don't really trust myself. I'm using wet glue because it does give me a couple of seconds to kind of move them around if needed. And then I just continued on throughout the entire card panel, filling all of these areas in. If you do have any areas where your glue kind of squishes out, let it dry and just use an adhesive eraser. I definitely did have to do that in a couple of different areas. So once it is dry, I'm going to go ahead and bring back out my paper trimmer, and you can do this with scissors. I just don't trust myself enough for such a large area. And I'm just going to line up the sides of my card panel and trim off all of these little strips that kind of hang off the side. And this makes it kind of look like you used a background die, but you didn't. It's very, very simple to do, and you can definitely use any color. I just wanted to keep it pretty simple. So next I kind of lined her up and realized that there was way too much white space here because she is kind of a smaller image and I don't really have anything else going on. So I'm going to bring in a diagonal stitched rectangle die, also by MFT, and I can't remember the exact name of it, but I will link it below, and I'll run that through my die cutting machine. And I did run this through twice just to make sure that I had no problem, being it's going through 2 layers here. Now you may have a couple of strips that kind of come up that you didn't have enough glue on. Just kind of lift those up and put a dot or 2 of glue down and you should have no problem. So once that was done, I'm going to take another piece of scrap paper here, and this is a purpley color that kind of matches the belt that she has. I am going to treat that with my anti-static tool, ink up my sentiment with Versamark ink, and sprinkle on some white embossing powder. Make sure your heat tool is heated up before bringing that to the paper, and then I went ahead and heat set that. Next, I cut that down into a strip just slightly larger than the sentiment itself, and I will take another piece of that same purple-ish cardstock that I also had in my scrap bin, and I'm going to use this as the background or the mat for my main panel. So I'll go ahead and adhere everything together again with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue, just because I like to have a couple of seconds to kind of shift things around if needed. Gluing that down to a white top folding A2 size note card, and then I will adhere everything together. So I'm going to go ahead and adhere her flat down just because I have a dimension already to the card that I didn't feel the need to pop her up or anything with foam tape. Same thing with the sentiment. I went ahead and adhered that flat down with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue again. And to fill in some of that blank space there, I used Nuvo Jewel Drops, and this is Pale Periwinkle. And I just added a few drops, squeezing a little bit onto that scrap piece of paper to make sure there's no air bubbles first. That is definitely a good idea unless you want it to kind of like splatter on your card, which I've had happen many, many times. So that is the first card. Moving on to the second card, this is going to be super simple. Taking some pink scrap pieces of paper here, and I just cut 2 single strips here, and these are also 1/4 inch, again using that grid mat or grid lines on my trimmer. And then I will trim a piece of the white cardstock here that I had left over from the previous card, and I'm just going to glue these horizontally on the bottom part of my card panel here. The 2 pink ones will be on top and bottom, and then I'll put that white strip right there in the center. Now I used my grid mat for the first one, and then I kind of just eyeballed the rest. And my card panel was a little bit smaller than those pink strips. So I'm just going to cut down my card panel just a teeny tiny bit on that one side where the strips don't meet the edge of it. And also trim off those additional strips that are kind of hanging off the one side. Now I also trimmed off a little bit on the top just to make it even, just to make it even around the card base itself, if that makes any sense. So I'll go ahead and kind of line everything up, decide how I want my placement here, and then I'll take the rest of that pink cardstock there and do the same thing with that sentiment, treat it with my anti-static tool, stamp it with Versamark, and sprinkle on white embossing powder and heat set that, cut that down into a strip. I'm going to go ahead and adhere that panel onto another A2 size note card and adhere everything together. Again, gluing this flat down just because, like I said, we have that a little bit of dimension with those strips of paper already. I don't really need any more. Gluing that sentiment strip, and to fill in those blank areas on this particular card, I'm going to bring out some Nuvo Dream Drops, and this is the color Love Potion. It's a little bit, it's a pale pink, but it dries kind of translucent. And again, squeezing that onto a scrap paper, making sure there's no air bubbles first. So that is the second card. Moving on to the third card, cutting down some strips of yellow cardstock here, and 2 of them are going to be 1/4 of an inch and 1 is going to be a 1/2 inch. And bringing out another white card panel here, and this time I am going to adhere these vertically off to the left-hand side of my panel. Again, gluing those with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue just to make sure that I have a little bit of time to adjust if needed. Using my grid mat, making sure those are lined up, or at least the first one, and then I can eyeball these skinny ones to make sure that they're pretty much even. At least to the eye. They may not be perfect, but you won't notice the difference once everything is said and done. Trimmed off any excess that's kind of hanging off my card panel there, and then I'll go ahead and adhere everything together. This time I am going to pop her up just to give a little bit more dimension, and I just use my Scotch foam tape for that. For my sentiment for this one, I'm going to go ahead and stamp this flat down. Now my sentiment was a little bit longer than is going to fit on that blank space on the card panel. So I took my scissors and I kind of stretch out my stamp to make sure that I don't trim any areas that I don't want to be trimmed. And then I'll line these 2 sentiments now onto my grid mat, making sure those are perfectly lined up. Pop those onto my acrylic block, and then I'll stamp these with VersaFine Onyx black ink directly above my little girl there. And now this was looking a little bit too plain, and I didn't want to add any more Nuvo drops to it. So what I did is I added a little bit of sparkle to the little strips that we had glued down. I'm using my Spectrum Noir shimmer pen there, and I just carefully went over those little strips, and this will add a little bit of sparkle and interest to the card. So that is it. Those are the 3 cards for today. Thank you guys so much for stopping by. I'll leave all the supplies listed below, and don't forget about the discount code for the Not Too Shabby shop. Have a great day, guys. Bye.